Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The first few months of Purity's marriage to Johnson felt like something carved out of calm waters. There was a quietness to their love, not loud, not dramatic, but soft and steady, like a candle flame in a dark room. Their apartment was small, just two rooms with faded cream walls and creaky tiles that carried every footstep like an echo, but it was enough for them. Purity had a good job with a logistics firm, and though it kept her busy and often exhausted, she never once complained. Johnson hadn't found work since they tied the knot, but she didn't mind. He cooked sometimes, ran errands, and was always home to greet her when she returned late. It wasn't the life she had pictured, but it was peaceful, and she told herself peace was enough. When she discovered she was pregnant, her heart danced. She had always wanted to be a mother. Johnson kissed her stomach that night and called their unborn child our first miracle. That moment settled deep in her heart, giving her a reason to keep moving forward despite the fatigue. Purity adjusted quickly to pregnancy, working longer hours while still managing the home when she could. Her life became a rhythm of phone calls, work trips, doctor appointments, and careful budgeting. Her job sometimes took her out of town for 2 or 3 days at a stretch, but she never thought too much about leaving Johnson alone. If anything, she believed her husband appreciated her sacrifice. She didn't ask him to look for work or contribute financially, not when her salary was enough to cover rent, food, and savings. It wasn't ideal, but she believed in growing together, even if it meant one partner carried more weight for a while. She often returned from trips with small gifts for him, shirts, snacks, or little gadgets she thought he'd like. Johnson would smile, kiss her on the forehead, and tell her she was the strongest woman he knew. It was easy to believe that kind of love meant safety. Then one night over dinner, Johnson brought up something unexpected. He suggested bringing his younger sister from their village to help around the house. He said it would take some pressure off Purity, especially now that she was pregnant and constantly tired. He made it sound like a kind gesture, like a brother being thoughtful. Purity, caught between a spoonful of rice and her own exhaustion, nodded without much thought. She trusted him. She imagined a shy village girl sweeping the compound, peeling yams in the kitchen, maybe helping her fold baby clothes once the child arrived. It seemed harmless, almost sweet. Johnson looked relieved by her response. "You'll love her," he said. "She's quiet and helpful. You'll see." That night, as Purity drifted off to sleep with her husband's hand resting protectively on her belly, she had no idea that the door she had just agreed to open would let in a storm that would tear through everything she thought she knew. The first time Purity saw her, it was a Monday afternoon. The sky was overcast, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered, and the city air carried the weight of heat trapped between buildings. Johnson had gone to the motor park early that morning, saying he wanted to pick his sister personally. Purity had taken a half day from work and was at home resting, her legs stretched out on the worn cushion in the sitting room. The sound of the front door opening stirred her lightly from a nap, and when she looked up, Johnson stepped in first with a smile, followed by a girl in her early 20s. She was slim, dark-skinned, with short, neatly plaited hair and a timid expression that hung on her face like a curtain. She didn't say much beyond a soft "good afternoon, Ma," as she bent her knees slightly in greeting. Her name was Chica, Johnson said with a casual arm around her shoulder, as though she were just another piece of furniture being added to the house. Purity nodded, managing a polite smile, even though something in her chest stirred, nothing loud, just a quiet shift. Chica settled into the house like someone who had always been part of it. Within days, she knew where everything was: plates, dish soap, Purity slippers, the shelf where her prenatal vitamins were kept. She moved like she belonged. She did the dishes without being told, swept the sitting room, and cooked if Purity was too tired. Johnson praised her often. "Chica's really making things easier for you," he'd say, and Purity would nod, trying to feel grateful. But occasionally, when she returned from work unannounced, she'd find Chica in the living room with her feet curled up on the couch or laughing softly at something Johnson had said. Nothing inappropriate, just comfortable. Too comfortable. Sometimes Chica would finish Purity's sentences when she spoke or answer questions directed at her, as if her presence had slowly expanded into spaces that weren't meant for her. Purity noticed, but she told herself not to be paranoid. This was Johnson's family, after all. Nights grew quieter. Johnson, who once waited eagerly to rub her feet or ask about her day, now spent more time watching football in the bedroom, or discussing local gossip with Chica over plates of roasted groundnuts. Purity often retreated to the balcony alone, breathing in the stale city air and wondering if this shift was normal or just her pregnancy hormones playing tricks. Chica's room was next to theirs, and sometimes Purity would hear faint laughter through the walls long after she turned in for the night. One evening, as she stepped into the kitchen for water, she caught Johnson and Chica talking in hushed tones, faces unusually close. They pulled apart the moment they saw her, acting natural, but the way Johnson quickly looked away made her stomach twist. She didn't say anything, just walked past them and drank her water slowly, her ears ringing. Something had changed in her home, and though she couldn't name it yet, she could feel it growing, creeping, waiting. The calendar pages flipped with quiet cruelty, each new week dragging Purity deeper into exhaustion. Her belly had begun to swell noticeably, and with it came the weight of fatigue that clung to her like wet clothes. Her job became more demanding, as a major project was entering its final stages, and deadlines came like waves against her peace. She barely had the strength to cook or sit through her prenatal classes, but she pressed on, trusting that she was building a future worth the present strain. Johnson had become less attentive, though never rude. He seemed busy within the house, always finding small tasks to distract himself, often with Chica nearby. They'd sometimes be in the kitchen together when she came home, talking in low tones, bursting into laughter that would fade the moment she stepped into view. Purity tried not to let her thoughts spiral. She reminded herself she was tired, and tired minds often imagined shadows that weren't there. But it wasn't just the shadows in her head anymore. The neighbors had started to notice things too, in their subtle, unspoken way. A woman from 2 flats away had mentioned one evening, as Purity walked past with a polythene bag of oranges, that this city has a way of showing people's real selves. Her voice had a tone, a loaded one, but Purity only smiled and walked on. Then came the sounds, strange bursts of music from her apartment while she was away on business, loud laughter, even a thump or two. A colleague who lived on the same floor once joked that her house had become livelier than a beer parlor. The comment left a bitter taste in Purity's mouth. She hadn't heard such noise herself. She was always gone when it happened. It was the silence when she returned that made everything feel more suspicious. Johnson never mentioned anything about visitors or celebrations, and Chica remained as polite and withdrawn in her presence as ever. But behind that politeness, Purity began to sense something tight, rehearsed. Her sleep grew restless. Dreams came jagged and unclear, and she often woke up in the middle of the night with her hands wrapped protectively around her belly. She didn't tell anyone how uneasy she felt, not her friend at work, not her mother over the phone. Everyone believed she had the perfect setup, a supportive husband, a helpful housemate, a steady job. She didn't want to disturb that illusion. But deep within her, something was beginning to shift, an ache in her chest that wasn't caused by the baby pressing on her ribs, but by the quiet feeling that she was being eased out of her own home. One morning, just before dawn, she sat at the edge of her bed watching Johnson sleep beside her, his body turned away. Chica's door was slightly ajar, a sliver of orange hallway light spilling across the floor. Purity stared at it, unmoving, as if the truth she didn't yet know was breathing through that crack, watching her right back. The morning sun filtered through the curtain slits like golden spears, soft but insistent. Purity adjusted her headscarf and stepped out of the gate with her work bag in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. Her steps were slower these days, heavy from both pregnancy and weariness, but she moved with her usual poise, nodding politely to the familiar neighbors as she made her way toward the roadside to hail a kiki. The compound was already alive, children laughing somewhere behind the building, a woman pounding yam in the shared backyard, and the usual mutter of radios playing low. Just before she reached the front gate, a figure stepped forward. It was Mama Tocci, the older woman who sold vegetables by the junction and lived in the flat above. She was wiping her hands on her wrapper as if she had been waiting. "Sister Purity," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "That girl in your house, is she really your husband's sister?" Purity blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected conversation this early, and certainly not one so direct. "Yes," she replied calmly, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's his sister." Mama Tocci nodded slowly, like someone mentally filing away a piece of information. There was a strange pause, too long to be comfortable, and then the older woman stepped aside to let her pass. Okay," she said, her voice trailing behind like a half-finished sentence. Purity didn't look back. She kept walking, even though her mind had already stopped in its tracks. The question echoed in her head with a dull, relentless beat. It hadn't been the words alone, but the way they had been asked, like a secret already known, waiting to see if she'd lie to herself. In the kiki, as the breeze rushed through the open sides and stirred her scarf, Purity stared blankly at the road ahead, her hands resting on her stomach. Her heart felt heavier than her belly. That evening, long after she returned from work and long after dinner was eaten in silence, she stood quietly at the bedroom door watching Johnson brush his hair in front of the mirror. She studied his face, every line and expression, searching for something she couldn't name. He looked up and met her eyes through the reflection. "You're quiet," he said, almost joking. She smiled faintly and walked to the wardrobe without answering. The silence between them wasn't new, but tonight it felt sharper. Chica had already gone to bed, or so she claimed, and the hallway light was off. The house felt unusually still, like something was holding its breath. Purity lay in bed that night with her back to Johnson, her hand gently circling her belly. Her thoughts moved in whispers, like dust under a door, unseen but present. For the first time, she didn't just feel tired. She felt watched, like the walls had begun to listen, like the truth she had tried to ignore was finally waking up and would soon speak for itself. It was a Wednesday, one of those unbearably hot days where the sun seemed to press its full weight on the rooftops, daring even the clouds to move. Purity had barely slept the night before. Her body was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and by midday, the heaviness in her limbs made it hard to concentrate at work. After a routine hospital checkup, her doctor had advised her to slow down. She decided, against her usual habit, to return home early. There was a strange urge bubbling in her, one she couldn't explain, just a need to be home. Not the kind of need that came from love or longing, but something unsettled, something raw. She took a cab instead of the office bus, clutching her handbag tightly across her chest as she looked out the window. The city passed by in noisy bursts, hawkers yelling, buses groaning, a child crying somewhere. But inside her, a silence grew, a silence that seemed to be pulling her towards something she wasn't ready for. As she turned the key and stepped into the apartment, the first thing that hit her wasn't the sight, it was the sound. Muffled laughter, then a breathy moan. She froze, the door still slightly ajar, her fingers trembling where they gripped the handle. She stepped further in, her feet quiet against the tiles. The living room was empty, but from the crack of the bedroom door, she could see the truth unraveling in real time. Clothes scattered, skin exposed, bodies tangled in movement. Her husband, Chica. She didn't scream. Her breath caught in her throat like a thorn, but no sound came. She stood there, long enough for Johnson to look up and see her, eyes wide, caught. Chica scrambled away from him, wrapping herself in a sheet, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. But Purity didn't move. Her hand slowly dropped from the doorknob, her back straightening. She turned, walked back out the way she came, and closed the door behind her without a word. Outside, the heat felt colder. The world was still moving, cars honking, people chatting in the distance, but for Purity, everything had stopped. Her heart didn't race. It sank. She found herself sitting on the front step of the building, her eyes staring at nothing. She could feel her baby shift in her womb, as though it, too, had sensed the fracture. In that moment, she wasn't a wife. She wasn't even a woman betrayed. She was just still, rooted, frozen in disbelief. A neighbor passed by, greeted her, then hesitated at her expression, but said nothing more. The wind picked up slightly, lifting the hem of her gown, brushing her face. Her palms lay flat against the concrete, absorbing its warmth. She wanted to scream, to tear at the sky, to ask the world why. But her lips remained sealed, because sometimes when something inside you breaks so suddenly, so brutally, the pain doesn't come out in sound. It just sits with you, like an unwanted guest who plans to stay. The house no longer felt like hers. Purity returned the next day, not because she had forgiven, not even because she was ready, but because her clothes were there, her baby things, her medical reports. She walked in slowly, half expecting the walls to whisper, half expecting the betrayal to still be naked in the air. But the house was quiet. Not a person in sight. Johnson was gone. So was Chica. The bed was unmade, drawers partially open, the wardrobe door hanging loose. The curtain fluttered with the soft breeze sneaking in through a window someone had forgotten to shut. She moved through the apartment without touching anything, her body heavy with the weight of betrayal and unborn life. In the corner of the living room, a small wrapper she had bought for the baby lay unopened, its colors bright and untouched, mocking her with their innocence. She reached for her phone, not to call him, but to check the joint account they had opened during the early months of their marriage. It was habit, almost mechanical, but the screen froze her. The balance was nearly empty. Her heart thudded once, then again, louder. She refreshed the page. Still the same. A total withdrawal. Every naira. Every sweat-earned contribution she had made. Her knees buckled slightly as she slumped onto the couch, breathing unevenly. He had taken it all, money, trust, stability. As the realization sank deeper, so did the truth. It wasn't an accident. None of it was. Not the girl, not the affair, not the timing. It had been a plan. All along. He had waited for her to be too pregnant, too vulnerable, too distracted. He had smiled through it all, kissed her goodnight, all while counting the days until he'd disappear. The betrayal wasn't just in what he did, it was in the calm with which he had done it. And what hurt the most was not the emptiness of her wallet, but the emptiness of the man she had trusted. He hadn't even tried to deny it. No note. No excuse. Just silence, and an echo of footsteps that had run away in the night with everything she thought she was building. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across her living room floor, Purity sat still, one hand on her belly, the other clenched on her lap. She wasn't crying. She didn't have tears left for him. But something inside her shifted, slowly, with purpose. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a decision, a silent vow. If Johnson thought she was broken, then he hadn't truly known her at all. Days passed like smoke, visible, but impossible to hold. Purity stopped going to work. She turned off her phone, drew the curtains, and moved only when necessary. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a shell, and she lived inside it like a ghost. Neighbors knocked sometimes, offering food or questions she couldn't answer. The landlord came once, worried about rent, and left when he saw her face. She barely spoke. Her baby kicked more now, perhaps sensing the silence or the absence of joy. And though she didn't cry, there were moments she would sit in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, staring at the floor for hours. Then one day, someone knocked differently, not with concern, but with familiarity. It was Emeka, Johnson's old friend. He stepped inside cautiously, as though he already knew too much. "I heard what happened," Emeka said, voice low, settling opposite her. Purity said nothing, just watched him. He rubbed his palms together slowly, eyes darting around the half-empty room before landing back on her. "That girl, she's not his sister." Purity didn't flinch. She had known this, deep down. Emeka continued. "They've been on and off for years. She was never far. Even when you were planning your wedding, she was around." His words were blunt, not cruel, just uncoded. Purity looked away. The ache in her chest deepened, not because of the confirmation, but because it made everything make sense. All the quiet glances, the laughter behind closed doors, the sudden distance, it had never been random. She had been chosen, not for love, but for convenience, stability, a job, a womb. Emeka shifted uncomfortably. He lied to everyone, even her, but she was always willing to wait in the shadows. He paused. "You were never the only one, Purity. You were just the visible one." That night, Purity sat with her legs propped on a low stool, her back against the couch, eyes tracing cracks in the ceiling she had never noticed before. It was strange how quickly truth could burn through illusion. How someone you loved could wear a face so expertly crafted, it took betrayal to see the real one. But what broke her wasn't that Johnson had lied. It was how easily he'd done it, how calculated he had been. Purity wasn't angry in the traditional sense. What she felt was colder, sharper, something under her skin that made her movements more deliberate, her thoughts more precise. She wasn't going to fall apart, not for him, not for a lie. And if the world believed she was weak, that she had been defeated, they were about to learn what happened when a woman like her stopped trusting and started planning. Purity began to move with a different kind of silence, the kind that carried intent. She made no public fuss, filed no police report, and told no family member the full truth. But every step she took was calculated, every action tucked neatly beneath the calm surface she presented to the world. She changed her account passwords, closed her old phone line, and quietly sold off a few of her unused belongings to gather some cash. Her belly was heavier now, her back ached constantly, but her mind was sharper than ever. She asked discreet questions in places Johnson never expected. She found out about a former job he once lied about holding, a fake business name tied to a rented shop in town. Everything about him, it seemed, was a patchwork of deceit. With patience, she connected dots until a picture formed, a man who had mastered manipulation, but never imagined he would have to run from the one he believed was too soft to strike back. Then strange things began to happen to Johnson. His new place, where he was hiding with the woman once introduced as a sister, became unstable. Jobs he had lined up mysteriously fell through. A few street boys he owed money started showing up at odd hours. Rumors spread that he had scammed people in the past, whispers resurfacing like dust shaken from an old carpet. His face became less relaxed, his voice more frantic when he called those few friends he still had left. One by one, they distanced themselves. Even the mistress, who had once shared his schemes with devotion, began to question the future she had chosen. She became cold, withdrawn. Johnson's temper returned, this time with no one to pacify him. He drank more, slept less, started yelling at things that weren't there. Purity heard all of this not through gossip, but through deliberate strings she had pulled, quiet conversations with those willing to talk for a small favor, an old neighbor, a curious bike man. She collected the reports without expression, each piece of his downfall folding into her like a calm breath. By the time Johnson's madness became visible, it was too late to save him. He was seen walking barefoot one afternoon, muttering to himself in the market, clutching a nylon bag filled with nothing but torn receipts. The woman he had ruined everything for had vanished, taking what little money remained. His eyes were wild, his clothes filthy. People who once greeted him now crossed the street. Some said he was cursed. Others claimed he had offended the wrong person. But Purity never corrected them. She had no desire to be named or pitied. Her victory wasn't in shouting or dragging him through court. It was in watching the quiet unraveling of a man who thought he had broken her. At home, she stood in front of the mirror, watching her belly move gently with life. There was still pain in her heart, yes, but also power. A calm, firm knowledge that she had survived, and more importantly, that she had won. The day her baby arrived was silent and golden. It was just before dawn, and the air outside was still, as if the world had paused to make space for a new beginning. Purity gave birth in a small private hospital on the outskirts of the city, one she had chosen quietly and carefully, away from the curious eyes of neighbors or distant relatives. There were no waiting family members in the hallway, no husband pacing with worry, no one to hold her hand as she screamed through the contractions. But she did it, gritted her teeth, held her breath, and brought life into the world with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the wreckage of her marriage. When the baby let out his first cry, Purity closed her eyes, not in pain, but in relief. She didn't feel broken. She felt complete. Holding him in her arms, she whispered a name she had chosen long ago, a name that meant rebirth. The nurse smiled and said he looked just like her. Purity smiled too. That was exactly what she wanted. In the weeks that followed, she began to rebuild, softly, carefully, and on her own terms. She moved out of the apartment where everything had fallen apart, choosing a small, quiet flat in a different neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it had sunlight, peace, and no ghosts in the walls. She took up part-time remote work, nothing too stressful, just enough to keep things running while she cared for her son. Mornings were filled with lullabies, warm baths, and gentle cooing. Afternoons brought sunlight through open windows, the kind that made everything look softer. She learned to laugh again, not loud or often, but genuinely. She no longer walked with her shoulders hunched or her eyes scanning for danger. The weight that had once crushed her chest had lifted, replaced by something steadier. The betrayal, the lies, the loss, they were still there, but they no longer owned her. They were part of her story, not the end of it. From time to time, she'd hear whispers about Johnson, how he roamed the streets aimlessly, barely recognizing anyone, how he slept behind the abandoned kiosk near the main road, muttering names from the past. People spoke about him with pity or fear. Some said karma had caught up with him. But Purity never joined those conversations. She had no bitterness left to offer. She didn't need anyone to know what she had endured or how she had survived. Her child was growing, her mind was clear, and her peace was real. One evening, as she rocked her baby to sleep beside the open window, she looked outside and watched the sun sink behind the city's rooftops. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was waiting for anything. She wasn't haunted anymore. She was healing. And in that quiet moment, wrapped in the scent of baby powder and dusk, Purity understood that rising wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just choosing to live fully, fiercely, and free. Years slid by without warning, quiet as dusk, reshaping everything in their path. Purity's life took on a rhythm that felt like music, steady, soft, and sometimes haunting in its beauty. Her son, Zion, was now 4 and full of the kind of questions that forced her to look inward. He had his father's eyes, but none of his shadows. Every morning he ran barefoot through their small compound with his toy car, laughing with a joy so pure it made her heart ache in a sweet, unexpected way. She had gone back to full-time work, still behind a laptop, still balancing invoices and calls, but with more control this time. She set her own pace, answered to no man, and allowed herself the grace of silence when needed. Her friends began to return, one by one, testing her waters gently, unsure if she still carried the weight of the past. She welcomed them with the kind of calm that could only come from someone who had rebuilt herself from rubble. The house was small but warm, with curtains that danced when the windows opened and walls that knew no secrets. Pictures of Zion lined a corner shelf, first steps, first teeth, birthdays she had single-handedly decorated for. Sometimes, when she swept the floor or folded laundry, memories of the old life crept in uninvited. Not just of Johnson, but of who she had once been, naive, trusting, stretched thin by the idea of love. She didn't hate that woman. In fact, she often whispered gratitude to her, because without that version of herself, the one who endured the silence and betrayal, there would be no her now. No quiet wisdom, no unshakable peace. People in her new neighborhood knew little of her past. They saw a woman who smiled easily but listened deeply, who spoke with care and moved like someone who had nothing to prove. They didn't ask about a husband. They just assumed she had chosen this life. And maybe, in a way, she had. One Sunday evening, as Zion napped with his cheek against her lap, Purity stared out through the open veranda, watching the mango tree across the street sway with the wind. The air smelled of rain and red dust, the kind that reminded her of childhood before everything got complicated. She thought of Johnson, not with longing, not with bitterness, but with quiet finality. His madness had become a cautionary tale in another neighborhood far from hers, a story people whispered when warning others about betrayal. But she didn't need revenge anymore. She had already outlived his chaos. She had named her storm and survived it. As she stroked Zion's hair and hummed a lullaby she hadn't sung in years, Purity realized she no longer saw herself as broken or abandoned. She was something else now, something whole. And in that soft moment, with the wind wrapping around her like a second skin, she smiled. Not because everything had gone right, but because she had made it through everything that went wrong. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.